The castles of Britain. Grand and beautiful, majestic and imposing. Some have been maintained throughout the centuries, but others have been forgotten, left to decay into history by ages past. But why were they built? Who were the men and women that built them? What events took place within and around their walls? And what stories can these age structures tell us today? Join me as I take a brief dive into the history of the castles of Britain. Today we take a brief dive into the history of Grosmont Castle in Monmouthshire, Wales. Grosmont Castle lies in the area of Wales historically known as the Welsh Marches or the Welsh Marchland, which is in southeast modern-day Wales. This area being called the Marches was essentially another way of saying that they were near the border of England and Wales. After William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066 and took over the country after defeating Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans set about controlling the population of their newly conquered land. Part of this process included constructing castles across the landscape as power bases to enforce their rule, and this is where Grosmont Castle's origins begin. After overrunning the land that would eventually hold Grosmont Castle, it is believed that the Normans constructed 3 castles in relative close proximity to one another in what would eventually become Monmouthshire, Wales. These castles included White Castle, Skenfrith Castle, and of course Grosmont Castle, named for the town of Grosmont, which is situated next to the castle and would have been much larger in medieval times. Although there were also other castles that would be built relatively close, such as the ones in Monmouth or Abrami, the 3 castles of Grosmont, Skenfrith, and White would all eventually be grouped together throughout the centuries and eventually be colloquially referred to as the 3 castles. To give perspective, Grosmont Castle, the furthest north of the 3 castles, is about 5 miles or 8 kilometers from White Castle, which is to the southwest, and about 4.12 miles or 6.63 kilometers from Skenfrith, which lies to the east-southeast. It is unclear when the 3 castles were built, but it is believed that they could have initially been built by William Fitz-Osbern, the Earl of Hereford, during the time of William the Conqueror, but these structures would have been made of wood. The 3 castles would not have been grouped together at this point into a separate lordship, but would still all have been under the control of Fitz-Osbern as Earl of Hereford. After Fitz-Osbern died, his second son Roger inherited his estates, but rebelled against William the Conqueror in 1075 and the so-called Revolt of the Earls, which caused the Conqueror to seize all of Roger's estates, which of course included the 3 castles. With the crown now controlling that area, the castles and/or estates began to be given away piecemeal during the reigns of William Rufus and Henry I. In the case of Grosmont Castle, this was most likely awarded to a man named Payne Fitzjohn, a royal official of Henry I and one of Henry's so-called new men, which essentially meant that Fitzjohn was a lower-born individual that was raised through the ranks by the king because the king knew that these new men would show stronger loyalty. In 1135, the year of Henry I's death, the Welsh rose in revolt, which caused the then new king, Stephen, to exchange lands for control of Grosmont Castle, along with White and Skenfrith. It was at this time that the 3 castles came into being as an official lordship known as the 3 castles discussed previously. A royal official named Ralph of Grosmont during the reign of Henry II began to make improvements during this time, which included the beginning of transitioning one of the castles, White Castle, from wood to stone. By the beginning of the 13th century, 1201 to be precise, the at the time new King John granted the 3 castles to a man named Hubert de Burgh. Hubert de Burgh played an important part in the English monarchy during his time, as he played key roles in the reigns of King John and Henry III. He would fall in and out of favor with King John, eventually become Chief Justiciar of England, played a large role in controlling Henry III during Henry's regency, and was famously involved in guarding King John's captured nephew, Arthur, who would eventually disappear under suspicious circumstances. The 3 castles were, for a time, granted to a man named William de Prowse, after de Burgh had been captured on the continent, but de Burgh was eventually able to gain the three castles back during the reign of Henry III when he was vying for power. New castle technology was being developed on the continent, and Hubert de Burgh, who had experienced new castle designs, began to utilize this new technology to update the three castles substantially. Most of de Burgh's updates were believed to have been geared towards Grosmont and Skenfrith, while White Castle was not said to have been updated until a later date. De Burgh again lost his castles for a time when he fell out of favor with Henry III, at which point the castles were controlled for the king by a man named Walleran Teutonicus for a short time. De Burgh regained the castles for a short time before falling out of favor again and dying. Walleran was again given charge of the castles for a time, who added a chapel to Grosmont. However, it is important to note that in 1233, prior to de Burgh's death, an interesting event took place at Grosmont Castle. This was the year that the 3rd Earl of Pembroke, a man named Richard Marshall, son of the famous warrior William Marshall, rose up against Henry III. Of course, there would be no shortage of people who rose up against Henry III during his time as king, Simon de Montfort being the most famous, as Henry III was despised by many due to the favor he showed his foreign family members and/or advisors. Henry III assembled an army to march on Richard Marshall's castles and camped outside of Grosmont in the fall of 1233. On November 11th, Marshall staged a surprise nighttime attack, which caught Henry III's army off guard and caused them to flee in disarray. Interestingly, involved in the raid on the side of Richard Marshall was none other than Hubert de Burgh himself, who was out of favor at the time with the king. This, however, was a small victory, and Richard was ultimately not able to gain enough support to sustain his rebellion, which forced him to retire to Ireland, where he died the next year. By 1254, the castles were given to Henry III's eldest son, Edward, the future Edward I, often referred to as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots. Edward is famous for his castle building in Wales, and he began further work on the three castles, although much of it was at neighboring White Castle, and very little, if anything, was done to Grosmont, which was already a nicely updated castle. Llewellyn ap Griffith's rebellion in 1260, which brought the three castles to the edge of hostile territory after Llewellyn's gains were recognized in 1267, made the three castles militarily more important. In 1267, the castles were granted to Henry III's younger son, the younger brother of Edward I, known as Edmund Crouchback, who was the Earl of Lancaster. The three castles would remain in Lancastrian hands, or in the Duchy of Lancaster, until 1825, which of counting is 558 years. However, it was here in the late 13th century that the beginning of the end began for the three castles. Edward I became king in 1272 after Henry III's death, and he ultimately defeated Llewellyn ap Griffith, killing him and conquering Wales as a whole along the way. This largely meant that the three castles were no longer as important militarily or strategically, although they would continue to be centers of administration for some time. The castles transitioned from Edmund Crouchback after his death in 1296 to his son Thomas of Lancaster, who was involved in the opposition to the new detested king at the time, Edward II. Thomas was executed for treason in 1322, and his lands, including the three castles, transitioned to the crown under Edward II. However, by the time Edward III came to the throne in 1327, the executed Thomas of Lancaster's younger brother Henry had come back into favor, and thus Henry was reinstated as Earl of Lancaster by the new king, which put the three castles back into Lancastrian possession, away from the crown. The 14th century would see the Earls of Lancaster update Grosmont significantly one final time, which will be discussed in the construction and layout section of this video. After Henry, who was the 3rd Earl of Lancaster, died, his eldest son, the famous Henry of Grosmont, who played a large role in the reign of Edward III, the 100 Years' War, and the beginning of the Order of the Garter, became the Earl of Lancaster and thus owner of the three castles. Henry of Grosmont, of course, derives his name from Grosmont Castle, as this was where he is believed to have been born in 1310. Grosmont Castle was said to have been one of his favorite residences. Henry of Grosmont, who eventually was elevated to the rank of Duke of Lancaster, had no sons, but one of his daughters, Blanche of Lancaster, married Edward III's famous third son, a man named John of Gaunt. After the death of Blanche's sister Maud, the three castles came into the possession of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt and Blanche were of course the parents of King Henry IV, also known as Henry Bolingbroke. After King Edward III died, his grandson Richard, son of the Black Prince, became Richard II and attempted to disinherit his first cousin, Henry, the future Henry IV, after his father John of Gaunt died. but Henry was able to mount a successful bid for the throne from exile on the continent to depose and eventually execute Richard in order to become King Henry IV. After this, the three castles once again became royal assets due to the crown belonging to the House of Lancaster at this time. Still, the castles remained as economic centers, but continued to see no military use. That is, with the exception of the rebellion of Owain Glendower in the 15th century. The end of the Glendower Rebellion between 1415 and 1421 was the last active military service for the three castles. As the Wars of the Roses came and went, and the Tudor dynasty came to be, the castles were said to have fallen into disrepair and largely abandoned by 1538, which would have been during the reign of Henry VIII. The three castles remained in Lancastrian hands until 1825, when they were sold to Henry Somerset, 6th Duke of Beaufort. By 1902, the Beaufort estate broke up the three castles and sold Grosmont Castle to Sir Joseph Bradley before it fell into state care in 1923. Grosmont is currently maintained by Cadw Welsh Historic Monuments. Let us now take a closer look at the construction and layout of Grosmont Castle. Grosmont Castle is located on the east side of the town of Grosmont in the county of Monmouthshire, Wales, and consists of two separate areas of earthwork. The first is obviously the motte-style earthwork on which the castle's inner ward sits, which is surrounded by a dry ditch. However, there was an outer ward at Grosmont, although the remains of it are difficult to detect. It would have existed to the south of the current castle, and the stone foundations of a two-roomed medieval building can be seen near the bridge, which would have sat within the walls of the outer ward. The inner ward consists of a hall to the northeast, a stone wall surrounding an inner ward, a gatehouse to the southeast, a block of domestic apartments to the north and northwest, and round towers to the west and southwest. Foundations of many internal buildings can be seen within the inner ward as well, which would have leaned to the curtain wall and would have most likely served as lodgings for servants. It should be noted, however, that some of the internal foundations were from the time of the Earls of Lancaster in the 14th century. As far as timing for construction goes, we remember that Grosmont most likely remained a wooden structure until Hubert de Burgh took over the castles in 1201. One of Hubert's first actions may have been to build some form of high-status apartments for himself, and this is most likely the time that the stone rectangular hall block at Grosmont began to be built. The rest of the castle, including what is now the stone gatehouse, stone round towers, and stone domestic apartments, would not have existed at this time and would have simply been a U-shaped wooden defensive wall or palisade atop the motte, but connecting to the stone hall block via a wooden square gatehouse. This phase of building would have been before de Burgh lost the castles to William de Braose after being captured on the continent during the reign of King John. However, once de Burgh returned from the continent and regained his castles during the reign of Henry III, significant updates began to be made to Grosmont between 1219 and 1232. The wooden defenses were replaced by stone ones, which included a trapezoid-shaped curtain wall being built with 3 circular towers on 3 corners of the wall. The wooden gatehouse would have been replaced by a 2-towered stone gatehouse at this time as well, although it would not have extended out as far as it does today. Grosmont remained in this state for some time until the 14th century rolled around and the Earls of Lancaster came into possession of the 3 castles. Grosmont was updated significantly either during the time of Henry of Grosmont or Henry of Grosmont's father, Henry III, Earl of Lancaster. A large rear arch was added to the southwest tower, and additional high-status floors were added above it as well when the rear of the tower was redone. The north tower was demolished by the Earls of Lancaster, and the current northern block of the housing suites, 3 in total, were constructed over it. These northern block additions would have been very high status, which is evidenced by the decorative octagonal chimney, which still survives above the center of the northern block to this day. Lastly, the gatehouse constructed by de Burgh was also extended out further by the Earls of Lancaster in the 14th century. Let us now take a brief look at some of the features still visible at Grosmont today. We will not be touching on every feature still remaining at Grosmont Castle today, but there is still a lot that can be seen from the ruined structures that remain. We start at the gate leading up to the castle. We can see the southwest tower clearly directly in front of us, which we will touch on shortly, the west tower to the left, the gatehouse in the center, and the hall on the far side. Moving through the gate, we end up in what would have been the outer ward in medieval times. We can see the deep ditch and the motte-style mound that the castle was built upon. We can also see parts of the gatehouse, which includes the furthest and newest extension of the gatehouse, including the pit. This belongs to the time of the Earls and the Dukes of Lancaster in the 14th century, between 1320 and 1360. The earlier round part of the gatehouse would have belonged to the time of Hubert de Burgh during the reign of Henry III in the 13th century, sometime between 1219 and 1232. Turning left, we can get a closer glimpse of the exterior of the southwest tower, which was initially built during the time of Hubert de Burgh in the 12th century, but whose top floors were updated during the time of the Lancastrian Earls in the 14th century. We can still see the high-status, flat-faced stones near the highest point of this tower. Moving past the gatehouse to the eastern end of the former outer ward, we can get a good view of the exterior of Hubert de Burgh's hall block, which we will discuss in more detail shortly. The hall is the earliest stone structure standing at Grosmont and belongs to Hubert's first tenure as owner of the three castles before he lost them after being captured on the continent. So this would be between 1201 and 1205. This stone hall would have, for a time, existed with only wooden palisades or walls surrounding the inner ward. The destroyed southeastern corner of the hall seen here would have housed a spiral staircase leading up to the upper floors. We can also see many of the ruined openings where windows would have been. Moving back to the bridge facing the gatehouse, we can see that much of the gatehouse has been destroyed, especially the east side and the chambers that would have existed above. This view also gives us another angle to the view of the updates made to the top of the southwest tower in the 14th century by the Earls of Lancaster. Moving through to the inner ward, we see the north block of domestic apartments that were built in the 14th century by the Lancastrian Earls. This was built on the outside of the existing curtain wall at the time. To the right of the chimney column, we can see an entrance to the furthest east of the three parts that make up the north block. This reflects a small square ground floor chamber with a window to the right. To the left of the chimney column, we see the second or middle part of the northern block. This was formerly a round tower built in the 13th century by Hubert de Burgh, but the Lancastrian Earls demolished it and put their new apartments over it. The base of the round tower was filled in at this time, but it has since been excavated in modern times, so the basement of the missing tower can be seen. The northern block building would have been 3 stories, with the second floor and third floor having access to the fireplace vented by the chimney. Both the second and third floors would have each been one open room. The round tower that was built over would have acted as a basement and would have been accessed by a stair from above, which can still be seen at the site today, right on the other side of this window. The third and furthest western part of the north block is largely destroyed, but one can still see the opening to the left of where the round tower used to stand. Taking a closer look at the octagonal chimney, we can see the ornate design at the top, which is an indication of how high status this northern block of apartments was at Grosmont Castle. We must remember that although the town of Grosmont is small now, in medieval times it was its own borough, and so would have had much more activity than it does today. Looking at another angle of the northern block, it is important to note that the corner angle between what is now the eastern side of the northern block and the Great Hall would have housed the postern gate during the time of Hubert de Burgh, but this was destroyed along with the northern tower when the northern block was built. Additionally, the northern block and the hall would have been connected by a doorway on the second floor here, first floor if you're British. Returning back towards the gatehouse and looking left at the southwest tower, we can see the grand arch at the back of this tower. Hubert de Burgh's tower that existed previously was not only updated with nicer upper floors, but the entire rear face of the tower was completely redone by the Earls of Lancaster in the 14th century, and the grand arch was added at this time. A short stair leads up to a platform, but we can see here that a stone wall cuts into the archway and goes almost to the stair. This would have been a later addition and would have housed several servants at the castle, but when the arch was built in the 14th century by the Earls of Lancaster, there would have been no obstruction to the arch. Many of these structures in the interior courtyard are either from the 14th century or after. Stepping into the southwest tower, one can see the high-status windows and fireplaces built into the walls of the top 3 floors. There is a basement here as well, which is similar to the one that can be seen in the demolished North Tower that we touched on previously. Back out in the courtyard, we can see the West Tower, which again was constructed by Hubert de Burgh, but updated by the Lancastrian earls in the 14th century. Arrow loops in deep recessed embrasures give perspective to the thickness of the walls. There would have been a basement here as well, but this has been filled in modern times. We lastly head to the wall walk between the Southwest Tower and the West Tower, which can still be accessed to this day. Looking down towards the courtyard, we can see the remains of Hubert de Burgh's hall block. This again is the oldest structure standing at the site and would have probably been built between 1201 to 1205 before King John seized Hubert's lands. The original entrance would have been via a wooden stair on the second level, first of here from Britain, and the two entrances at the first floor, or ground floor, seen in the center would have been added during de Burgh's second tenure as owner of the castle, so during the time that the gatehouse, curtain wall, and towers were being constructed during the reign of Henry III. The center dividing wall within the hall can also be seen here, which would have been from the same time frame. The hall itself would have been on the second floor on the southern two-thirds of the block, with the northern third being perhaps a solar for the Lord, which is a room separated by a wooden wall. This is indicated by the location of a second-story fireplace, which tends to be at the center of halls. With the fireplace being offset, it has been concluded that a solar or additional room must have existed on the second floor, which would have been blocked off by a wooden wall. Looking at this artist's recreation of the hall block, we can see the second-story entrance via a wooden stair, the two lower doors, and the fireplace on the upper floor of the hall. Many, but not all of the openings seen in the walls of the hall are former windows. Moving into the hall looking south, we can see the remains of the fireplace of the lower floor, which is flanked by two windows, and the chimney can still be seen rising above. The fireplace for the hall would have been on the eastern wall of the upper floor. Turning the other direction within the hall, we can see the other half of the hall block. The northwest corner opening would have connected to the northern block of apartments discussed previously after they had been constructed in the 14th century, and again, the upper floor here was thought to have been a private room for the Lord. As we return to the wall walk by the southwest tower and turn to face the exterior of the castle, we are greeted with a view of the village of Grosmont and the spire of the Church of St. Nicholas, which dates to the 13th century as well. If you are interested in visiting Grosmont Castle, you can find more information on Cadw's website, link in the description. Okay, this wraps up the history of Grosmont Castle in Monmouthshire, Wales. This is Brief History signing off. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one. Cheers.